Hello, everybody. Due to some technical difficulties, we had to start over again, but we're happy to have you here on a glorious day in the gardens at Monticello. My name's Peggy Cornett, and I'm Curator of Plants here, and I'm joined by
Bill Barker here, out of costume, not as Mr. Jefferson for our gathering this afternoon, but comfortably as myself in company with our Peggy Cornett, foremost, if you will, in our understanding of Jefferson and horticulture, the plant world, universal. So this is a blessing for me, Peggy. Thank you for inviting me along.
Well, we love having you here too, and you know, Bill and I set this up a few weeks ago as a presentation to another group, and we thought we would just add a few of our favorite quotes in with our talk today. And so we brought it in a notebook so that we get the wording correct. But our basic theme is to talk about Jefferson and friendship, botany and friendship, and Jefferson's many friends that he had around the world. And in relation to horticulture and gardening, and one of his best friends was Madame de Tessé in France. You want to tell us a little bit about her?
He was enamored of her, Madame de Tessé, Madame de Hottentot. Madame de Tessé was the aunt of Adrienne Lafayette, the Marquis de Lafayette's wife, and as a consequence, she was a Noailles relevant to the relationship with the royal family, the Bourbon family, so very well connected. And Mr. Jefferson fell very easily into that society, particularly the ladies' salons that were held every week, the gentlemen's salons, and in particular, Madame de Tessé was quite the horticulturalist and interested in gardens.
She had a fabulous garden in an estate really called Chaville outside of Paris. And she was really asking Jefferson to have plants sent to her on a regular basis from North America. People were crazy about our North American plants. And of course, Jefferson was trying to entice everybody to grow our wonderful species, our native trees especially. I mean, I was just today looking at the dogwoods are just so brilliant. They're almost blinding. They're so white and beautiful. And those were some of the trees, the red buds, but also large trees, tulip poplars and white oaks. But he once wrote to her. I don't know if you can find what he talked about, her ability, her courage to undertake in planting trees. Yeah.
Mr. Jefferson writes, precisely, these are the precise words, so this is not sort of a rattling in the conversation as I frequently engage myself in persona. But this is what he said distinctly, I quote, "I cannot but admire your courage in undertaking now to plant trees. It has always been my passion, insomuch that I rarely ever planted a flower in my life. But when I return to live at Monticello, I believe I shall become a florist. The labors of the year in that line are repaid within the year, and death, which will be at my door, shall find me unembarrassed in long-lived undertakings." Beautiful poetry.
Yeah. Well, of course, he did grow flowers at Monticello, and but he just seemed to be interested in growing all kinds of things. So one of the plants that he was trying to send to Madame de Tessé was a newly discovered plant, and it was the Venus's flytrap, a very curious native species on the coast. It had just been introduced or discovered by John and William Bartram from Philadelphia, and it was first sent, this curious plant that eats insects, as you know, was sent to Europe in the 1760s, and everybody had to have it. And so Jefferson was trying to follow suit and get some plants or seeds for Madame de Tessé. And you know, the Native American name for that plant it was called Tippetawitchet. I'm not sure what that means, but it's very almost. But I love that he tried getting this plant for her, and he kept striking out. It's a very rare plant. It's actually an endangered species now. It grows in the kind of swampy areas or the wetland areas of the borders of North and South Carolina. And so he was trying to get this naturalist named Benjamin Hawkins of Warrenton, North Carolina,
Oh my.
to collect seed for her. And he just kept striking out and eventually did get seed, but I don't think he ever could grow it. But he wrote to her, and I love this because after all these failures, he wrote to her of his frustration, and he said, "Botany is the school of patience, and its amateurs learn resignation from daily disappointments." So I can relate to that.
Doesn't he say as well,
Mhm.
I always strive to plant an overabundance because I know I'm going to have a failure.
That's right. The failure of one thing is repaired by the success of another.
Mm.
But you know, this idea of plants with sensibility was something that he brought up again with his friend Margaret Bayard Smith.
Oh, yeah.
And he talked to her, I think it's a few pages in, where she wanted his geranium plant that he had when he was president in the president's house, and she begged him to leave this geranium plant, which Jefferson was a little bit embarrassed about. But she said, and this is what she wrote. I'll do a little bit of a dramatic reading of Margaret Bayard Smith, who was a Washington socialite, by the way,
Hmm.
then a good friend, another plant person that he enjoyed her company. And she wrote to him, "I have seen in your cabinet a geranium which I understand you cultivated with your own hands. If you do not take it home with you, I entreat you to leave it with me. I cannot tell you how inexpressibly precious it be to my heart. It shall be attended with the assiduity of affection and watered with tears of regret each day as I attend it."
Oh, my,
And
my.
Mr. Jefferson writes back,
Mr. Jefferson, in all of his authority of office, in his particular official usage of an explanation, replies, I quote, Thomas Jefferson presents his respectful salutations to Mrs. Smith and sends her the geranium she expressed a willingness to receive. It is in very bad condition, having been neglected latterly and not intended to be removed. He cannot give it his parting blessing more effectually than by consigning it to the nursing hand of Mrs. Smith. If plants have sensibility, as their organization with ours seems to indicate, it cannot but be proudly sensible of her fostering attentions.
there's so much in that quote because, you know, people had interesting ideas about plants that had feelings. I mean, Jefferson grew the sensitive plant in the flower
Yeah.
garden. And again, that was another plant that people were very curious about how it would just fold up when you touched it. It's one of the more popular plants in the flower gardens today because children love to torture it, you know.
Oh, yes. I can't think of a plant with more sensitivity and taste, perhaps,
Mhm.
than a Venus flytrap.
Right. Well, yeah, again, I don't think he was ever successful, but it's just one of those many failures that he tried. But
You know, it's interesting, Peggy, that a number of these individuals that he has met and have become so influential in his correspondence upon matters horticultural. He has met in centers of commerce, Madame de Tessé in Paris, and
mhm,
actually Margaret Bayard Smith and her husband, Samuel Harrison Smith, he first met in Philadelphia. And they were
okay.
well acquainted, of
Mhm,
course, with Bernard McMahon, the
mhm,
horticulturalist in Philadelphia, William Hamilton out at the Woodlands, and the Bartrams.
mhm.
When Jefferson was Secretary of State, at the time the yellow fever was about to hit, that summer of 1793 and 17 into the winter, the autumn of 93, Jefferson actually had a sort of summer retreat on the banks of the Schuylkill River.
Yes,
And it was right across from Bartram's
Bartram's Garden.
Gardens.
That's right. Yeah.
So he could look right across to Bartram's Gardens, visit Bartram's Gardens, and I'm certain in many occasions in the company of the Smiths as
And
well.
that was near the Woodlands where William Hamilton lived. It was an
Exactly.
incredible association of very amazing people that I would have loved to have known. And, you know, it was there on the banks of the Schuylkill River where he was dining under the high plane trees.
Oh,
And he, there's a great, this is a letter he wrote to his daughter. It's kind of early on here. I'm not sure what page it is, but he's wanting to um, uh, embower his house with shade.
Shade.
I think it's on page 2 or 3.
Ah.
Oh, it's all here. It is page 3. Yeah.
This is what I love. Here's Mr. Jefferson growing up in the forest primeval here in the western woodlands of Virginia. And he writes, I am still planting trees to yield their shade and ornament half a century hence. Too old to plant trees for my gratification, I shall do it for posterity.
And then below that, he's telling Martha about planting the trees around the house. Yep.
Ah.
Yeah.
The only rival which I have known in America is what may be seen in England. England's sunless climate has permitted them to adopt what is certainly a beauty of the very first order in landscape. Their canvas is of open ground, variegated with clumps of trees distributed with taste. They need no more of wood than will serve to embrace a lawn or glade. But under the beaming, constant, and almost vertical sun of Virginia, shade is an elysium. In the absence of this, no beauty of the eye can be enjoyed. There we go, another element of poetic prose.
Well, springtime was a very favorite season of Jefferson's, and he wrote to a friend of his who in 1796 about his love of the spring season. And I'm not sure if you can find it. It might be page 8 or so. He's talking about his indisposition. Yeah.
As far as my indisposition and solitude would permit, I have been in the enjoyment of our delicious spring. The soft, genial temperature of the season, just above the want of life, enlivened by the reanimation of birds, flowers, the fields, forests, and gardens, has been truly delightful and continues to be so. And here we are in that Elysium.
You know, it is a wonderful time of year to be at Monticello. We always tell people to come and visit Monticello during the month of April. It's the season of Garden Week in Virginia, Historic Garden Week. Many visitors will be coming here, I guess, next week, actually. And it's also a time when our tulips have been at their peak. Every year we plant thousands of tulips, probably many more than Jefferson would have known, but we have a magnificent display. And as the days are getting warmer, we're beginning to see the waning or the decline of the tulips and the hyacinths, but they're giving way to other flowers in the garden. And we have that wonderful quote that he wrote about the bells of the day, which I don't know if I've got the right page for you.
Let me find it here. That is one beauty.
But the reason he's
there they go.
Yeah, here we go.
You know,
he's writing to his granddaughters about the gardens.
Yes, and I wish you could come and visit us at Monticello and stay for months as the new year begins, truly the new year. You were talking about all of the tulips, and far more tulips than Jefferson would have ever known planted on the mountain. But to be able to watch, Debbie Donnelly, let alone you, and everyone planting these bulbs in the fall, and they're continually at it, and you're wondering, well, what's it going to look like? And when the spring comes on, and first we begin to see the daffodils, the narcissus, if you will, pop up and bloom, and then to be followed with the red buds. They are perhaps my
really
personal favorite.
This year. Yes.
Just gorgeous this year, and all throughout the woods, particularly on the other side in the deer park and everything.
That's right.
As they, and then to be followed with the dogwood, as we are seeing now. It is the tulip that then pops up and adds the true display to all of this from the soil. And listen to what Mr. Jefferson writes with respect to all of this happening, blooming, and then beginning to wane. The houses and the trees stand where they did. The flowers come forth like the bells of the day, have their short reign of beauty and splendor, and retire, like them, to the more interesting office of reproducing their like. The hyacinths and tulips are off the stage. The irises are giving place to the belladonnas, as these will to the tuberoses, etc. As your mamma has done to you, my dear Anne, as you will do to the sisters of little John, and as I shall soon and cheerfully do to you all in wishing you a long, long good night.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of embodies the whole life cycle of all of these plants and then brings it into the life of the family together. And it's interesting that that's sort of what's happening right now. He talks about the iris coming into bloom, and we have irises, or as Jefferson would call them, flags,
Mm.
which is a common name for iris, are all about the mountain. I've been doing some research into the Garden Club of Virginia's work when they restored the gardens in the late 30s and 40s, early 40s, and they talk about irises that have moved down the mountain or are growing in various places that they believed were descended from Jefferson's time period,
Mm.
and they were bringing them back up into the garden. So we have the Iris pallida, which is the plum tart iris in the garden, and also the Iris germanica in the gardens that are transplanted from various locations on the mountain, which is very exciting, I think.
It is wonderful.
Mhm.
I've often wondered not only the plants that continually reappear here every year as to how long they have been here, but I've also noticed the wildlife, which seems to have
Mhm.
a sense of home here and
Mhm.
almost an ancient sense of where they have always been, those well before them. And that goes not only, of course, for rodents such as squirrels, but it goes for the hawks
Mhm.
and the mockingbirds that
Mockingbirds
we
are
find.
always here.
They're at
Yeah.
home.
Yeah, I mean, we have what I call resident mockingbirds, and they're territorial. There's a mockingbird that's in the vegetable garden, and I think some are near the house, and they're two different locations of mockingbirds. And of course, we'll be getting other migratory birds coming soon. The brown thrashers and the warblers are coming through. The wonderful orioles and the like. So we're going to be hearing lots of birds just in the coming months, really,
Mm.
which is always so exciting.
Oh, it is. It's the sound of nature, that wonderful sound of nature,
Mm-hmm.
a feeling of being at one up here on the mountain and within this vicinage. I mean, look at where we sit. We sit at the so-called ocean view.
Yeah, that's right.
Mm.
We're on the edge of the vegetable garden terrace, which is we're actually just beyond the midpoint. If you can see the pavilion behind me, that's at the midpoint of the vegetable garden, which is 1,000 feet long and 80 feet wide. It's a magnificent terrace that was carved out of the hillside by enslaved labor who were brought here actually from a neighboring plantation. And spent 3 years building this vegetable garden terrace. So
Mm.
it is quite a stunning sight, really. I mean, people are always amazed when they come and stand at the top of the hill on Mulberry Row and take a look at this great expanse. And of course, behind us, then we have Montalto, which is another um,
Mm.
mountain, a feature behind Monticello, the big mountain behind Monticello. So.
When you were mentioning the enslaved families that have come here to attend to all of the industry, imagine that so many of them were initially settled in the Tidewater.
Yeah,
In
that's
the
true.
flat lands,
Mhm,
and so many came here as part of Mrs. Jefferson's dowry,
mhm.
her marriage dowry. So coming here to attend to a whole new terrain must have been extraordinarily challenging for them.
That's right.
And I've often thought in the terracing of the gardens, and I know we've talked about this, that young Jefferson at Williamsburg, when he's attending the Royal College of William and Mary, must have become familiar with the terraced gardens of the governor's palace.
Right. Mhm,
And
mhm,
I think, could that have been an idea for him then as he decides to live up on top
mhm.
of the mountain to terrace this off? Do you know whether this was a terrace before he moved here?
No, they were gardening on a hill, on a slope, and so part of the reason for terracing was just to prevent the erosion that was gonna ha was continuing to happen when you're trying to garden on a slope. So it really just made a lot of sense. And all of this was undertaken while Jefferson was still president. So it was during his final 3 years as president, second term, and he was directing this work as well as the flower garden, the laying out of the flower garden beds during the final 3 years of his presidency. So that when he returned here in 1809, the vegetable garden was complete. That was the first year that Wormley Hughes was manuring the beds, and they were planting the first seeds of the vegetable garden that they would continue planting all the way until, well, we know it at least until 1824, according to his garden book. So, and the flower gardens were also completed during that year as well.
Yes, and to think too, even while he's president, while he's in the office at the president's house, he's improving the lawn of the president's house. He's gardening.
He had a lot of distractions there, especially during his second term as president.
And he had his mockingbird, pet mockingbird.
That's right.
There in the office as president as well. And didn't he provide somewhat the ha-has on the south lawn of the president's house? I think embankments.
Yeah, well, I think he had a lot to do with the way the landscape was laid out around the president's house as well. Yeah.
Unending.
Well, we shouldn't talk while we're in the vegetable garden. We should talk about his friendship with George Divers at Farmington, which is a neighboring. I guess it's a bit of a distance, but he was considered a neighbor of Jefferson's, and he had a farm in Farmington, and he was actually considered a very good gardener. And he and Jefferson liked to engage his neighbors in a friendly competition to see who could bring the first English pea to table every spring. It's kind of a famous story. You may have already heard it, but
Great story.
Jefferson, you would think, because Jefferson has this microclimate here in the vegetable garden, we're above the low-lying frost, we're south-facing, it warms up early. He gets his peas in February. I mean, every year, the first thing mentioned in the garden book was the sowing of peas, in earliest February and into March. And so we would assume that Jefferson would be bringing the peas in first thing. But apparently George Divers was always winning this contest, except for 1 year. Do you know the story about that?
Yes, it's a well-known story. Mr. Jefferson and George Divers of Farmington, very good friends, and very much at the same time in competition with one and the other in their vegetable gardens, competing over who can produce the first batch of peas. And the point of the matter in this competition that you have to let it be known in the neighborhood, let it to be known, all the farmers, because whoever has the first batch of peas then welcomes the entire neighborhood. To dinner, to the table, to the bowls of peas they're prepared for them. And so there's one particular year, Mr. Jefferson's peas are the first to be available, but he neglects to say anything about it. And
I don't know I think, didn't his daughter say, oh, just let him win? Because he wins every year.
Well, yes, Mr. Divers then lets it be known.
Different stories.
Yes, and Mrs. Randolph, his daughter, says, Papa, he's just let it be known. Mr. Divers has let it be known. He came up with the first batch of peas. I can only imagine Mr. Jefferson say, well, let him do that. After all, we'll get a free dinner at Farmington out of this.
Well, it must have been a wonderful event, though, for everyone to get together and just enjoy spring, enjoy the first dish of peas. I mean, that has to be quite a momentous occasion. And Mr. Divers was very good at preserving a lot of seeds. We know that Jefferson really would turn to him a lot of times when they had crop failures and seed saving. So this is how you relied on your neighbors. You couldn't just go out to the farmer's market or to the hardware store and buy more packets of seed if you ran out. You had to rely on what you save every year, or on your neighbors who might still be preserving these precious seeds from the garden.
Exactly. To think about preserving the seeds, and so from cabinet, then to ground, from ground and farm to table. There it is, the complete cycle throughout the entire year. Always fresh and then preserved after the harvest time for the next year.
Well, Jefferson's garden book, it's almost like a spreadsheet where he has columns and dates of when things were planted, and then they would sprout. And then he has this wonderful column that's called "Come to Table," just very
Oh,
simple. Come to table, and that's when it was, harvested and brought and cooked and brought to table. Yeah.
yeah.
So,
Mm.
do we have questions though? I haven't heard any from our friends out there, but we've been talking an awful lot about just all kinds of topics.
Yeah, so we had a question from online. Curious to hear what is Mr. Jefferson's favorite flower and what's his favorite tree?
Oh dear. Well, he does mention tulips a lot, but I don't know if that was his. It may have been one of his favorites.
I would think
It's
the
so
tulip.
curious, yeah.
And of course, we just read his comments about the geranium. He loves
That's
the
right.
geranium.
And of course, he loved the tulip poplar and the white oak. He said they were the Juno and Jupiter of our
That's right.
groves. That was his quote to Madame de Tessé, actually.
Mhm.
So I think he did like our native species of trees. And it's interesting. After he died, one of his granddaughters was sending plants to her sister in Massachusetts, in Boston, and she was sending some of their favorite small trees, like the Chionanthus, the fringe tree.
Hmm.
And she said they had a beautiful fringe tree here in the meadow. That's flowers draped over the rocks and the
Mhm.
water, and then the silver bell, which they call the snowdrop tree. And so there's interesting references to these smaller trees that the granddaughters really
Right.
enjoyed too.
I can't help but think that, of course, again, when he's a young man in Williamsburg, that I'm trying to remember those trees that were planted along the palace green. Very, very messy. The catalpas.
Yeah.
Well, they were considered very exotic, weren't they not?
Well, they're native.
Yeah, but weren't they? I mean, they were
But
just
they have large leaves.
large leaves, and so then
and the seed pods.
the
Yeah.
seed pods.
Mhm.
And Mr. Jefferson suggests, as they don't last but about 70 years, that they ought to be taken down in tulip poplars. Tulip poplars to be planted along the palace green will have a very fragrant flower as well, and they're with roots that go directly down into the ground, tap roots as we call them, and he just felt that they would last much longer and are very stately for such a position.
Well, he also loved oaks. He had not just the white oak, which he thought was the grandest of the oaks, but he also liked the willow oak, which is there are two very large willow oaks near the west lawn, one by the fish pond and one on the north side. They grow very fast, but he really planned to have a lot of those also planted. And then what's coming into bloom now are the umbrella magnolias, which are the deciduous magnolia with the leaves are starting to come out with the white magnolia flowers. They're quite lovely. So
they are beautiful.
And that was also planted in the grove. So we could go on about all his favorite trees, but trees were mentioned quite a lot in Jefferson's hierarchy of favorite plants, for sure.
But I still can't get over the fact that there he is in Philadelphia almost at the dawn of the yellow fever, and he writes, "I've never understood the value of trees before."
Yeah, he said, "I wish my house was embowered with shade."
Yeah.
So, but he was talking about the high plane tree, which is a sycamore, which are native sycamore tree. So they are quite magnificent.
Do we have another question?
So we have another question from online, and since we're not mic'd, if you could just repeat the question. Someone is curious about any sort of seed exchange that may have occurred between Jefferson, Washington, and George Mason in terms of tobacco, recognizing it was taxing on the land.
Oh,
tobacco. Okay. Well, I know Jefferson. I don't know if he and Washington exchanged too many seeds.
there doesn't seem to be the extent of that in their correspondence.
Yeah, but they did talk about that sort of thing. Jefferson was obtaining seeds from, the question was whether there was a seed exchange between George Washington and Jefferson
and George Mason.
George Mason, yeah. And so, there was, Mason was had a big vegetable garden as well, and a fruit garden. Yeah. So I think it was more with the trees and large trees and fruits and that sort of thing. But yeah, I have a lot of that in my mind right now.
I think Jefferson, don't you, more or less appreciated the exchange of seeds with nurserymen and botanists such as
Right.
Bernard McMahon or William Prince
Exactly.
at his gardens.
Well, Bernard McMahon was out of Philadelphia, and he was really his book American Gardener's Calendar, which Jefferson received a copy of in 1806, was really quite a guide for Jefferson. It it literally was a calendar of how to garden, and so month by month it would explain what you should be doing in your garden. And Jefferson really relied on the American Gardener's Calendar quite a lot. You know, I mean, he copied passages out of it into his own notebooks, so we know that he was definitely relying on that. And McMahon was supplying Jefferson with seeds, bulbs, and trees, and even tender plants for the greenhouse. So he was a wealth of information and material for the garden. And then the Prince Nursery in Philadelphia, I mean in New York, on Long Island, that was an incredible source of not only fruit trees and the sugar maple came from the Prince Nursery,
Yeah.
and roses. At least 10 different varieties of roses came from the Prince Nursery. So.
I think it was right after Madison and Jefferson took their trip to the
That's right.
Northern Lakes.
They took a side trip to the Prince Nursery.
The Prince Nursery, because of the sugar maples. They had
That's
become
right.
acquainted with it up in New England, and so they wanted to try this out. But they never got any sugar maple syrup, did they?
Not here, but he did plant a lot of trees. He received a lot. He made a huge order from the Prince Nursery. It was quite interesting to see how interested he was in a variety of plants for this landscape here. Yeah. Well, we have I'm not sure how much longer we have. Is our time?
Did you have one more question?
Another question.
I think for one more question.
One more question.
We have a question from the Wallace House and Old Dutch Parsonage State Historic Site. They are curious if horticulture was part of a formal education in Jefferson's day.
Was horticulture a formal education? Well, I know botany was.
Botany would be part of the, what did they call that? The curriculum of natural philosophy.
Yeah. And he said that at one point he talked about designing landscape by fancy. He said not just horticulture, but basically being a landscape designer, following the arts. So I think horticulture was probably not the kind of curriculum you would have today, but people did learn how to garden. They learned how to propagate, to do cuttings and budding and grafting. So that knowledge was passed on, but it was probably more in schools where you actually studied botany and other of the sciences.
Yeah. And when you would be, mathematics and the sciences were pretty much co-joined in that realm as well, along with the study of astronomy, I believe, or geometry, however you want to relate to mathematics, astronomy, and the sciences. Botany very much at the foremost of that, and geography as well. Peggy, I'm thinking again, when Jefferson's a young man in Williamsburg, his cousin is John Randolph, whose brother is Peyton Randolph, Peyton becoming the first president of the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Peyton and John's father is Sir John Randolph, who was Attorney General for the Crown in Virginia. But John Randolph created a gardener's calendar too,
That's right.
did he not? And was very much a horticulturalist.
Very early on, and that was printed in Williamsburg, I believe. Yes. I forgot the title of the booklet, but it's very useful for our research as well. Yeah. So, well, I was thinking that maybe you could also do a bit of a reading of Jefferson's letter to Charles Wilson Peel, which I think is on 17 or so.
Yes, it is.
And he actually wrote this letter when he was at Poplar Forest, his retreat home near Lynchburg, Virginia. So he wasn't even here at Monticello, but it sort of sounds like he was. Yeah.
It really does. And this is in 1812, the late summer of 1812. And Mr. Jefferson writes, "I have often thought that if heaven had given me choice of my position and calling, it should have been on a rich spot of earth, well watered, and near a good market for the productions of the garden. No occupation is so delightful to me as the culture of the earth, and no culture comparable to that of the garden. Such a variety of subjects, someone always coming to perfection, the failure of one thing repaired by the success of another, and instead of one harvest, a continued one throughout the year, under a total want of demand, except for our family table. I am devoted to the garden. Though an old man, I am but a young gardener.
So sorry for my
Oh,
coffee.
no. This is all part of what we put up with at the pollen season, so you can imagine.
But that passage has so many quotes that we love to use in the garden, so I think it really sums up this time of year.
Well, you must come visit us, partake of this Elysium here, particularly this time of year. We still have a few weeks left. The dogwood are coming out. Our irises are still here. But as you know, some of the bells of the day have already been presented as debutantes and are now retiring.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy.